What up, people? I really want to do a Slavoj Žižek impression, but I don't know how many of you know who that guy is. I'd look him up. He's a weird dude. But anyway, that's not important. What is important is talking about world history, because this, as usual, is AP World History with Mr. Ansharsky. Today, we are going to talk about the First World War. We are on chapter 4 of Unit 7. So your bell work is on the screen. Last video, we talked about the causes of World War I. Today, we're going to actually look at the war itself. Like I said, we're going to talk about World War I today. So the lesson objective today, what you're responding to in the daily summaries, is explain how governments used a variety of methods to conduct war since 1900. You should discuss the First World War. So we're going to first look at the early war. Then we are going to look at events across the international community. Then we're going to look at the end of the war, the peace treaties, and what are the immediate results on European and Western society. World War I is typically called the Great War in history. It is referring, of course, to the magnitude of the war itself, not necessarily because it was a super awesome, fun time. It's also going to sometimes be called the Cousin War because a lot of the heads of the European monarchies were actually related to each other. Yes, the King of England, George, I believe, the Fifth, he was related to Kaiser Wilhelm II, who was related to Nicholas II of Russia. But regardless of what you call the First World War, it is going to be a catastrophic event in human history, as we're going to see. But what does the war look like between 1914 and 1917? Well, initially, there is going to be a lot of optimism for the First World War. There's this optimistic feeling that the war is going to be over by Christmas. We have all of these new military technologies. Those guys wouldn't dream of killing each other. That is outrageous. So there's a general feeling of optimism that the war isn't going to be all that bad, quite frankly. And part of the reason why some countries think it will be a quicker war than it really will be is because of military mobilization plans that were put in place during the 1800s, during the forging of these alliances that we talked about in our last presentation. So one of these mobilization plans is going to be a plan by the Germans known as the Schlieffen Plan. This is essentially Germany trying to prevent a two-front war with Russia and France on its western side. So what is Germany going to do? Well, Germany is not going to invade France through the French-German border. It's going to sneak attack for ×2 damage across Belgium. Belgium, a neutral country. They are going to surprise the French, overwhelm them, and take out their capital in Paris before switching their attention to the Russians. And yet, little did Germany realize, guess who Belgium was best friends with? You guessed right. Well, you remembered correctly, I should say. Great Britain. Great Britain has an alliance with the Belgians. So, after Germany invades Belgium, the British are dragged into this war. They are going to send troops to defend its new ally with France against the Germans. However, warfare has largely changed since the 1800s. The last big war in Europe was the Napoleonic Wars, the wars of the coalition with the French Revolution. So really, we are seeing the kind of unfortunate pairing of outdated military strategies and new military technologies. Before the First World War, a lot of military strategies kind of went like this. A lot of battles went like this. You have one side who's over here defending. And then you have the other side who's going to charge. And typically it's going to be a contest of who gets there faster or who shoots their guns a lot quicker. But the problem with World War I is that we have new military technologies that absolutely devastate these military strategies. We have machine guns, we have poison gas and tanks. That's just going to absolutely destroy anyone trying to charge at you. So when we have the deployment of these battlefield technologies, we are going to have to see changes in warfare. And what is that going to look like? Well, let's go back to the drawing board, literally. We are going to see intense military fortifications in the form of trenches appear along this border between France and Germany. We are going to see the digging of trenches, which you can kind of see. Let me get a darker color, actually. Clear drawings, format. We'll do red because a lot of people are dying. So we are going to see the digging of trenches across the German and French border. These trenches, which I'll show pictures of in a second, are going to be places where these defensive technologies are used to prevent the other side from invading. So literally, they are going to dig into the earth. They'll set up machine guns and try and prevent the other side from crossing their trenches. But as you can imagine, both sides are evenly matched. Both sides have the same military tech. Both sides have these trenches. So we are going to see an overall stalemate across what we call the Western Front. This is the area of fighting, mostly between France, Britain, against Germany. This is mostly occurring along this border between France and Germany, from the English Channel up here all the way down south to Switzerland, to neutral Switzerland. So not a lot of territory is actually going to be gained in this early part of the war because both sides are so evenly matched. Typically, before World War I, battles, they often resulted in one side gaining miles of territory. Now, if you're lucky, it's feet. On an extremely bad day, it's mere inches. And the reason why there's not a lot of territory being claimed, it's because of these intense military technologies that support defense systems, like the machine gun especially. So a lot of the First World War is going to be characterized by trench warfare. And let me show what those trenches looked like before I move on to the next slide. So the trenches themselves basically are structured like this. One side is going to have a lot of trenches. They're going to have reserve or support trenches. There's going to be a constant shelling to try and soften up the enemy. But typically, the enemy is not going to get softened up. But assuming they are, then you're going to see charges into no man's land. This is between the two opposing sides. You got the Allies, or I guess it's going to show different. You got the Allies in France, and you got the Germans over here. And in between these two lines, that's no man's land. You're going to have one side saying, go over the top. We have to take the German trenches and try and get into German territory. So you're going to have charges into no man's land, but that is going to be very disastrous for really both sides because these military defense systems can easily cut down these charges. You also got barbed wire. You got constant shelling going on. You got airplanes that are going to do reconnaissance missions and also bomb people. It's not funny. It is an extremely brutal form of warfare. And it's all because of these new military technologies. Look at how well defended these soldiers are. They're literally dug into the ground. They can only be softened by artillery if they can actually hit them. Look at this guy, he's smiling. That's inaccurate because they're not going to really be smiling in these trenches. And why is that? Well, beyond the problems of not gaining any territory, these trenches are terrible places for the soldiers to constantly be in. Typically, a World War I soldier is going to see combat about 10% of their service, realistically. 90% of it is sitting and waiting for a counterattack, waiting for the chance to attack the enemy. So it's a really boring place to be in, excusing all of the battlefield stuff. But it's also a very dangerous place outside of combat. We have pests, rats especially. We have lice. So we're going to see, as a result of these very cramped quarters, the spread of disease. And what diseases are we seeing, and why are we seeing them? Well, for one thing, it goes back to how these trenches are actually made. They're made literally into the mud, into the dirt. And there's not going to be a lot in the way of irrigation. So all of that water is going to pool in these trenches. And what does that do? Well, it makes the latrines overflow. So you have literal human waste that soldiers are constantly around. But you also have something called trench foot. Trench foot, essentially, the skin is constantly exposed to moist environments. That's going to cause the skin to literally crack. And in the cracks of the skin, we see the disease coming in. We see bacterial infections. This is called trench foot. And oftentimes, that's going to lead to amputations, if you're lucky, if they catch it before it spreads. So we have the spread of disease, mostly through trench foot, mostly seen with things like trench foot. You're also seeing a lot of deaths from physical combat injuries. World War I is unique in terms of a change, because a lot of the battlefield casualties are not disease. They're literal deaths in the line of duty. They are things like getting shrapnel lodged into your body. This is the result of new military technologies. That's why we see more battlefield deaths rather than deaths from disease. And these battles are leaving both physical scars, as you can imagine, but they're also leaving new mental scars. So these trenches are very brutal places to be in. They're very stressful situations for any person to be in. And we're going to see the rise of a new diagnosis, of a new recognition of disease, of mental health related issues. And that's going to be this new idea of shell shock, the idea that there are battlefield stresses that can leave long-lasting trauma. If someone with shell shock was diagnosed today, they'd probably be diagnosed with some form of combat PTSD, of post-traumatic stress disorder. So the soldiers in these trenches not only receiving these dangerous conditions in terms of battlefield wounds, but also of these mental scars as well. So when the soldiers actually return home, they are going to bring with them very wounded experiences. But we'll talk about that more later. Arguably, one of the worst years of World War I is 1916. 1916 is going to see a lot of intense, bloody fighting. We are going to see two major battles where not a lot of territory is gained by either side, and are going to leave long-lasting environmental, but also physical impacts on the soldiers themselves. So we have things like the Battle of Verdun between the French and the Germans. Not a lot of territory is going to be gained by either side, but guess what happens? In a matter of a few days, we're going to see the loss of hundreds of thousands of soldiers on both sides. I believe the statistic, and I can't see my paper right now. I guess I could look. I'm going to go look at it. I'm a historian. At the Verdun, we are going to see at least 500,000 dead soldiers, both French and German. But not a lot of territory gained on either side. And for comparison, real quick, about 600,000, in some cases 700,000, people died in the American Civil War over a period of 4 years. In a matter of days, almost 500,000 people died. That's how brutal World War I combat truly is as a result of these intense military fortifications. We're also seeing very bloody battles at the Battle of the Somme. In the first day alone, we're going to see 100,000 German and British soldiers die. By the end of the battle, that number is somewhere close to 1 million people. 1 million soldiers dying on both sides, and little to show for it other than wounded and mangled soldiers. So trench warfare, extremely brutal conditions. We have these intense military fortifications that prevent advancement on either side. And it's largely the result of new technologies like the machine gun. The machine gun is going to mow down Europe's finest, and as we'll see, the finest of other countries around the world. So we have these well-fortified positions where not a lot of territory is gained on either side. If you have time, I would watch at least the clip from the Young Indiana Jones episode that I have linked. I can't remember the exact time marks, but they are linked on the actual video for the presentation. Very brutal combat. If you can't access that for whatever reason, there's also this clip from the film 1917. It shows two British soldiers going into no man's land, nomad sky or whatever. Anyway, no man's land. Very, very disgusting conditions of these trenches. And in the no man's land, dead bodies everywhere, barbed wire and mangled earth everywhere. We're not going to watch that right now. So, in addition to these land changes, we are going to see changes in how military conflicts are waged, not only on land, but in the air as well and on the sea. And again, it goes back to this idea of new technologies. We have airplanes, we have zeppelins. A zeppelin, this type of blimp thing right here, mostly going to be used by the Germans, not used by anyone else really. I think we should bring them back, quite frankly. I think they look cool. You shouldn't light a match near them, though, because they'll just explode into flames, but that's a different thing. But why are zeppelins and airplanes important? Well, for one thing, they're going to mostly be used for reconnaissance in World War I. But they're also going to be used for a new type of military strategy, air raids. We are going to see, not as bad as World War II, but we will see targeting of civilian areas, largely to break civilian morale. And we'll talk about this idea more later. But zeppelins and airplanes largely being used for reconnaissance missions, but they also are being used in this new strategy of air raids to break civilian morale. But we're also seeing changes at sea. We are seeing the use of the submarine. Especially, this is going to be used by the Germans. They called their submarines U-boats, Unterseeboots. It's been a while. Submarines are going to be used to break naval blockades. And blockades obviously have existed since we've had boats, but they're going to be used in World War I, mostly by the British to starve out the Germans. So Germany's not going to see a lot of naval supplies being brought into Germany because of this British blockade. Germany, as we'll see later on, is largely going to suffer starvation during the First World War. So how do they respond to this blockade? Well, you need to break the ships, but you need to do it so they can't see. Radar hasn't been invented yet. So submarines, perfect way to blow up British blockade ships and to ensure trade to Germany. But Germany is going to take the fight to the British coastline as well. What's he going to do? Or the Germans going to do? They are going to impose a new type of military strategy called unrestricted submarine warfare. This is essentially going to say any ship going to Great Britain has the potential to be a military target and should be blown up. So we are going to see the targeting of not only British supply ships, but also British passenger ships. So in many ways, Germany is kind of put against a wall. They need to break this blockade any way possible, I should say. So they are going to unleash their submarine navy to break the British blockade. However, there are going to be a few incidents where attacking neutral ships is going to make a lot of people angry, a lot of countries hostile towards one another. And one of the incidents is the sinking of the Lusitania right here. The Lusitania was a British passenger ship, but it carried about 120 Americans on it. 124, I think, is the exact number. 139, I was wrong. Jeez. Cheese and rice. There we go. So the Lusitania is going to explode. 139 Americans die. And that is going to raise a lot of hostile tensions between the Americans and the Germans, because the US is not going to get involved right away in World War I. They stay out of it. But the sinking of the Lusitania is intensifying tensions between the Americans and the Germans. So we have new strategies of warfare. We have the use of submarines in unrestricted warfare, unrestricted submarine warfare. We have air raids on civilian areas. These are the results of new technologies. But we also have a new military technology that really hasn't been used before, and that is poison gas, chemical warfare. We are going to see the deployment of chemical gas like chlorine, phosgene, mustard gas. And really, it's kind of scary, this poison gas, because the effects kind of vary depending on the variety of gas. It could kill you straight up, or it could have very, very long-lasting problems in terms of respiration, in terms of physical scars. So with things like chlorine gas, if you are constantly exposed to it, you could literally die of asphyxiation. You could choke to death. Oftentimes, you'll choke on your own blood. That's how terrible chlorine gas is. It smells like bleach. So if you're ever in a chlorine gas attack, there you go. Phosgene is also going to be a deadly disease. It's colorless and odorless, and you're unsure if you're going to die from it. You slowly die with phosgene gas. That's how dangerous it is. The Allies are going to use this the most. Mustard gas is also going to be a terrible, terrible disease or terrible chemical agent because oftentimes it's not going to kill you directly. It is going to blind you. It is going to lead to infections. And arguably, it is going to also make the most casualties in World War One in terms of chemical warfare. But mustard gas also has a long-term environmental impact. You can see the image right here that it literally seeps into the land. And if you were to dig up that land, you could release mustard gas. It's a very, very traumatizing and deadly disease. Oftentimes, it's not going to be lethal, but it does leave long-lasting scars. It can lead to blindness. That's how terrible it is. So we have these new technologies. We have these new ways of conducting military strategy. This is a famous image of World War I. It's not actually of a battlefield, but it is kind of showing how immediate these gas attacks would occur. This is showing how gas wasn't designed to prevent these military advancements. This is an image apparently of American troops training. That guy is simulating being choked to death with something like chlorine gas. So you should be able to describe the war in the Western Front in Europe. What are some changes we are seeing in terms of the military? Well, World War I is called World War I for two reasons. One, there's going to be another world war. And two, it truly is a world war. Why? Well, because of these alliances, because of these imperial colonies and the motivation to get more territory. So we are going to see fighting around the world. We're going to see fighting really in every continent except two, South America and Antarctica. Although I think it would be pretty funny if there were German penguins who had the little Kaiser hats on. Anyway. But we looked at the Western Front, and arguably you could say that's the most memorable front if you are Western European trash. But there is going to be fighting in other places as well. We're going to see fighting in the Eastern Front and in Italy as well. But let's first look at Italy. Italy is initially going to be on the Central Powers side. They are going to ally themselves with the Germans and the Austrians. And mostly, Italy is going to join them because of their mostly conservative monarchy. They want to ally themselves with other conservative monarchies like the Germans, like the Austrians. But the Austrians have something that the Italians want, and that is land with Italian-speaking people. So Italy is going to ditch the Central Powers, and it's going to make a switcheroo and join the Allies during World War I. They want Italian-speaking territory that the Austrians have. So we are going to see a lot of intense fighting in the Italian campaign. Mostly it's going to be in the mountains, in the Alps between Italy and Austria. We are going to see very brutal conditions because of high elevation. We are going to see a lot of assaults against either side, and they are going to result in a lot of military deaths. There's going to be a series of battles, of 12 battles, over the same piece of territory in a place called Ianzo. 12 battles along the Alps between Italy and Austria. And you can see how weird this fighting is because they're literally using cranes to carry all of this equipment over mountains. So the Italian campaign is going to be a brutal one, and one that's not really supported by a lot of Italians back home. And as we're going to see, Italy doesn't get much out of World War I. They don't get all that wonderful Italian-speaking territory that they think they deserve. But we'll get to there when we talk about the rise of Mussolini and fascism. But we'll get there, don't worry. What's going on between the Russians and the Germans and the Austrians? Well, really, Germany is mostly going to be focused on France. France and Britain, highly industrial powers. So Germany's not going to care all that much. They are going to do some fighting against the Russians, but they are going to mostly have to rely on the Austrians to fight the Russians. So we are going to see Russia and Austria. These two countries are going to have intense difficulties. They generally boil down to a very similar problem. Both of these countries are not industrialized states. Both of these countries have a lot of ethnic tensions, and as such, not going to have a lot of military cohesion. So, what's facing each of these armies? That is going to lead to a lot of military deaths, mostly out of incompetence. Well, in Austro-Hungarian army, we are going to see a lot of problems in terms of soldier loyalty. Because for the most part, the officers speak German. They're Austrians. But the soldiers themselves come from a variety of different ethnic groups. There are Slavs and Bosniaks and Hungarians and Czechs and Slovaks. And there's a lot of these nationalistic feelings among the soldiers in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Nobody's listening to their commanders because their commanders are inept generals. They're aristocrats that don't really care about the good of the nation. They care about their own loyalties. They care about their own personal gain. Russia kind of faces similar difficulties. But more importantly for us in the future is going to be the lack of industrialization. Why is this bad? Well, Russia is largely not going to be prepared for the First World War. Russia is going to think that this war is going to be over in a matter of months. They're not really going to stockpile anything. They're going to run out of supplies 10 days into the conflict, for God's sake. They're going to not have enough clothes for their soldiers. They're not going to have enough uniforms for their soldiers. They're not going to have enough food for their soldiers. Hell, they don't even have enough guns for their soldiers. The marching order for the Russian army is, if you don't have a gun and the guy next to you dies and has a gun, pick up their gun. It's that simple. So Russia is going to suffer a string of military defeats during World War I. And this is going to make the war in Russia deeply, deeply unpopular. And this is going to lead to a change of government, as we'll talk about in our next presentation. We are going to see Russia pull out of the war. We are going to see Russia pull out of the war because of this intense unpopularity of this military conflict. So in 1917, after the Russian Revolution, after more specifically the October Revolution, we are going to see Russia pull out of the war in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. This is going to be a major treaty where Russia is going to give up a lot of territory to the Germans and Austrians in exchange for peace. So we are going to see the rise of new states in Eastern Europe after we see the decline of the German Empire, after we see the decline of the Russians and the Austro-Hungarians. But this is going to be a major problem for the Allies. The Germans no longer have to deal with the Russians. They can focus their attention in France. But we'll get to what happens there later on. But World War I is going to be a conflict that is fought outside of Europe as well. We are going to see fighting across all of the places Europe has imperialized over the last century. I'll be right back. I'm a little hungry. Man's got to eat sometimes. You know, it's good to take frequent breaks. Hopefully you learn to skip ahead during that. But anyway, back to talking about World War I. Well, World War I is going to see conflict not only in Europe, as I said, but in areas that will be impacted by European imperialism. We are going to see fighting not only in Europe, as I said, but in Africa and East Asia as well. We are going to see the inclusion of new states in the Allied war effort. And that's mostly going to be in East Asia. We got the Chinese who are going to join the Allies. Why is that? Well, the Chinese are looking to expel the Germans at the very least. And they're also thinking, okay, if we have more friendly relations with the Allies, with the Western European powers, maybe we can kind of convince them, hey, can you not be here? Maybe they'll step down their economic presence in China. Maybe they will grant Chinese full independence from European free trade imperialism. Japan's also going to join the war. They're looking to claim more territory. They're looking to claim German territory, especially in the South Pacific. Excuse me. So we are going to see fighting across East Asia, and we will see the inclusion of the Chinese and the Japanese as well. And yet, fighting is also going to take place in Africa, especially because there is going to be this lingering competition for territory in Africa. Those Germans have some nice land. What if we, the British or the French, took over that land? So the competition for colonial territory is why we will see fighting. Germany is going to lose a lot of its colonies pretty early on in the war. We are going to see the frequent use of soldiers in these African countries to defend European colonial land. So we are going to see a lot of African soldiers being used not only in Africa, but also in Europe. About 1 million native Africans are going to serve in World War I. So these European powers are going to utilize their colonies not only for natural resources, as they usually do, but also for military soldiers. So African and Asian colonies do provide raw materials and soldiers to be used by the Europeans. But how do the Europeans force cooperation? Well, they're going to provide promises of independence after the war is over. If you cooperate now, maybe we'll consider granting you independence. So we are going to see the promise of independence in exchange for cooperation. In exchange for cooperation, we are going to see promises of independence. Yet, as we'll see later on, that's largely not going to play out. And we'll talk about the impact of this much more later on. We're also going to see fighting in the Middle East. And why is that? Well, it's because we're going to see the involvement of the Ottomans. The Ottomans are going to join the war against the Allies, more specifically against the guys with Russia. The Ottomans want Russian territory. They want to expand not only into Central Asia, but they also want to possibly, maybe one day, expand into the Balkans again. So the Ottomans really want Russian territory. But they also want territory occupied by an ethnic group called the Armenians. And the Armenians They have their own territory in the Ottoman Empire, but it's territory that lines up against the Russian border. And there are going to be rumors, accusations thrown around that the Armenians are supporting the Russians. And to eliminate this potential internal threat, we are going to see a policy of genocide against ethnic Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. The Armenians, they claim, are pro-Russian. They're Russian Orthodox Christians. Naturally, they're going to help the Russians, according to the Ottoman Turks. Remember, the young Turks who are in power by now, they are extremely nationalistic. They have ideas of Turkish racial superiority. So the Armenian genocide is one way we are seeing how civilians are impacted in this war. They become, quote unquote, legitimate targets because they are aiding the enemy. But the idea of the Ottomans being an enemy of the Allied powers is very attractive to those seeking territory in the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans are in a state of decline. And now we have a perfect opportunity to make sure that there is European claim to Ottoman territory. So we are going to see Allied efforts to try and take Ottoman territory, to invade the capital of Istanbul. Well, that's not going to work out all that well because the French and the British are going to be met by heavy opposition by the Ottomans, aided by their German allies. This is going to result in a very disastrous battle called the Gallipoli Campaign, or the Battle of Gallipoli. So, the failure of the Allies to win at Gallipoli is going to force them to realize we need to shift our military strategy. We need to look up ways to break up the Ottoman Empire. Let's look at the Ottoman Empire's problem with nationalism and try to break it up. Well, it's going to be the British especially who are very interested in this idea of intervention to break up the Ottoman Empire. So the British are going to make a lot of promises to groups who want to separate from the Ottoman Empire. And one of those groups are going to be the Arabs. The Arabs, an ethnic group in the Arabian Peninsula, and in the farthest corners of the Ottoman Empire, they are going to seize their chance and stage a revolt under the direction of this guy right here, played by Alec Guinness in the famous movie, King Faisal I. Faisal is going to organize this Arab revolt against the Ottomans, looking to seek Arab independence. And Faisal is going to be assisted by the British and their envoy, Lawrence, T.E. Lawrence, I should say. This is the Lawrence of Arabia of yore. So using British support, we are going to see the Arabs declare their independence from the Ottoman Empire. And they are going to engage in a series of guerrilla campaigns against the Ottomans. And in exchange for cooperation in taking out the Ottomans, we are going to see promises of independence after the war is over. Faisal is promised a territory that will make up the modern-day state of Iraq. However, as we're going to see, we are not going to have complete independence for Arab countries. But in addition to making promises to Arabs, the British are making promises to Jews as well. And it goes back to an idea known as Zionism. Zionism essentially is this notion that the Jews deserve a homeland in, well, anywhere. But by the end of the 1800s, as a result of this guy right here, Theodor Herzl, that homeland should be in the Middle East, should be in the quote unquote ancestral homeland of the Jewish people. So this is going to be viewed as the British as a perfect opportunity to further fragment the Ottomans. If we created a Jewish state in the ruins of the Ottoman Empire. So we are going to see this support for a Jewish state in the Middle East, in the region known as Palestine, in the Balfour Declaration. The Secretary of Foreign Affairs, or the Secretary of State essentially, is going to, by the last name of Balfour, is going to promise the Jews a piece of land in the Middle East, the piece of land that will become the state of Israel later on. However, it's important to realize right here that land largely occupied right now by Arabs. Not a lot of Jewish settlers. But now the British government is saying, hey, Jews, we support you having your own territory in the Middle East. What do you mean there's people already living there? Well, we'll talk about this more later on. It gets complicated. So to break up the Ottoman Empire, we see the British supporting these movements. The Arab Revolt, we're seeing the support of Zionism, of the protection of a Jewish state. But another place that's going to get involved is the greatest country in the world, the United States of America. The Americans are, like I said earlier, not going to get involved initially in the First World War. They're largely going to stay out of it. This is a European thing. I'm not into it. But despite this official stance of neutrality, the U.S. is going to sell arms and supplies to both sides. The U.S. is going to be unfathomably wealthy as a result of its wartime trading. And it's trading to both sides. It's providing loans to the Germans and the British of guns and ships to the French. Ironic twist right there. But it's very clear who the Americans are supporting. I don't have the exact statistics in front of me, but about about $2 million worth of funding, of loans, are going to go to the Germans. About $2 billion to the British. So it's extremely clear who the British favor, the Americans favor. So the Americans are going to send a lot of supplies to mostly the British. And this is going to make the Americans a quote unquote legitimate target for military strategies like submarine warfare. We are going to see the sinking of the Lusitania as a result of this close alliance with the British. Remember the Lusitania, that British passenger ship that was carrying Americans as well. To be fair to the Germans, the Lusitania was also carrying guns. It was carrying shipments for the Allied war effort. Needless to say, this is going to create a lot of hostilities between the Germans and the Americans. But things are going to get really terrible after the sending and interception of the Zimmermann telegraph. The foreign secretary in the German Empire, a guy with the last name Zimmermann, is going to send a secret message to Mexico saying, hey, Mexico, if you help us out, if you support us against the Allies, we'll help you out. We'll let you claim territory that the Americans stole from you in the Mexican-American War. This is going to be intercepted by the British. It doesn't make the Mexican government. And this is going to absolutely infuriate the American public. Oh my God, those terrible Germans are looking to conspire with the Mexicans to take our land. So in 1917, the United States is going to join the war on the side of the Allies. And I'm going to argue, as we'll see in a second, that American involvement in World War I is going to be why the Allies win. They are going to tip the scale, the stalemate, in favor of the Allies. But we'll talk about that in a second. You should be able to identify how the war is developing outside of Western Europe. But the war is not only being fought on the battlefield. We are also seeing the waging of a war in the so-called home front. What is the home front? Well, essentially, the home front is this idea that to support the war effort, you also need civilians to do their part back home. Our boys are in the trenches. We need the guys and gals left home to do their share. And this is very much related to this notion of total war. The idea that the whole of society is necessary to wage a conflict. We not only need the men to valiantly serve on the field, but we also need women to work the jobs the men no longer can do because they're off fighting. So we are going to see strategies of how governments are going to mobilize their people to conduct warfare. They need to get more people on their side. There's going to be intense propaganda campaigns. We are going to see this appeal to nationalism, especially as we talked about in our last presentation. We're also going to see how governments are ensuring there's enough supplies for the troops. We're going to see that with rationing. What is rationing? Rationing is limiting how much food you consume on a daily basis. Because after all, we need all of this food to help our boys in the trenches. So governments are going to initiate campaigns to limit consumption of fuel and food to send enough to the soldiers to support the war effort. Rationing is going to be the most intense in places like Germany, because Germany is not going to have a lot of supplies coming in because of the British blockade. Would I suffer as a result of rationing? Yes, I would. Because a lot of non-essential food stuff like sugar is going to be something that not a lot of civilians have access to, because you need to save as much stuff as you can to send to our boys in the trenches. We're also going to see changes in the labor pool as well. We're going to see new groups of people working in fields typically dominated by men. The men are off fighting. And who is left? It's going to largely be middle class and working class women. But it's not just factories where we're going to see more female participation in the workforce. We are going to see women acting as police officers. We're going to see women acting as managers of companies. We'll see women working white-collar jobs. We're going to see women working as medical professionals. We're going to see female postal workers and pilots. Again, they're stepping up because a lot of Europe's men and America's men are off fighting in this war. We're also going to see more minorities involved in the war effort. We are going to see, in the United States, for example, more African-American participation in the industrial workforce. Because a lot of the white factories in the North, a lot of the factories in the North are dominated by white male workers. But if they're all called up for the war effort to fight in Germany and in France, or I should say France more accurately, you are going to see a vast a great migration, you could say, of African Americans going north to work in recently opened factory positions. Again, to support the war effort. We're also seeing how colonial subjects are being used in factories and raw material extraction to support the war effort. I'm the most professional teacher I know. However, because civilians play a role in the military strategies, in many ways, they're going to become military targets. We saw that with the Armenian genocide. We saw how there was the suspicion the Armenians were aiding the Russians, so they became targets for genocide. But civilians are also going to be targeted in air raids. We are going to see early campaigns from these Zeppelins and airplanes bombing civilian targets to decrease civilian morale. But arguably one of the hardest hit countries as a result of these new ideas of impacting civilian morale is going to be Germany. Remember, Germany is going to have a British blockade, not a lot of resources coming into Germany. Germany is literally going to have a period of starvation. We are going to see a mass breakdown of the social order in Germany as a result of the lack of food, which is going to contribute to an increased call to end this terrible conflict, to pull Germany out of the war. So the German home front is going to suffer a lot during the First World War, which is going to leave a lot of scars, mentally and physically, on this notion that the Allies really mistreated Germany. Sorry, I'm hungry. The war is going to end. And why is it going to end? Well, it's largely going to end because that stalemate in the Western Front was broken. Remember, the Allies were in a pretty precarious situation by 1917. Russia is no longer going to be in the war. They pull out as a result of the Russian Revolution. So that means the Germans can focus all of their attention on the French and the British. But what do you know it? It's 1917 when the Americans join the conflict. They're literally coming in, bugles blaring, and they are fresh off the boat. They're enthusiastic, ready for war, well supplied. They are so inexperienced in the horrors of conflict. They're called doughboys, which I think is a pretty funny name. But needless to say, the Americans provide the extra oomph for the Allies to drive into German territory. And while there is a breakdown of the social order in Germany, there's also going to be a breakdown of the military structure in Germany as well. We're going to see German soldiers deserting the military. They're hungry. They're looking for food. They're looking for Starburst. So Germany is going to see a collapse of its military. And Germany is really going to be by itself by the end of the war. We are going to see the Ottomans distracted with its nationalist movements like the Arabs and the Zionism. The Austro-Hungarian Empire is just going to collapse. I mean, talk about an empire that can't hold itself together. Austro-Hungarians, they are going to surrender pretty early in 1918, or pretty late in 1918. So Austria-Hungary is just going to collapse. As we're going to see, ethnic nationalism broke apart the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So Germany's really off by itself right now. It's in a state of chaos politically. There's potential communist revolution brewing. So Germany has really no choice but to sign an armistice, a truce with the Allies, saying, let's end this conflict, let's pursue peace. So, famous date, November 11th, 1918, World War I is going to largely end, at least in Western Europe. But this isn't a permanent peace, and we'll talk about the attempts for a permanent peace later on. But what is the impact of the First World War? Well, as you might imagine, these terrible new military technologies mixed with outdated military strategies, that is going to leave a lot of people dead over the course of 4 years. We're going to see maximum estimates of 22 million soldiers who die in this First World War. That is a lot of people, quite frankly. It is a massive amount that no one is really prepared for. Remember, everyone thought this war would be over by Christmas. It was over after 4 years. So in 4 years, the world was able to mangle itself through all of this fighting. Speaking of the physical scars of war, we are going to see a significant amount of returning soldiers who have physical and mental scars. That's kind of the phrase I've been using repeatedly. We are going to see a lot of amputees. We will see soldiers coming home with shell shock, with post-traumatic stress disorder. And they're bringing with them a lot of pessimism and cynicism. Our governments made me kill someone. What a terrible thing to admit to yourself. So we are seeing all of this fighting. Shell-shocked and gassed and wounded young men returning home to Britain, France, and Germany. We're also going to see how civilians are impacted. We talked about those air raids. We talked about the Armenian genocide. We're also going to see the displacement of refugees. Belgium becomes a literal war zone. So these refugees need to go someplace safe. We are going to see the displacement of groups of people. In Russia, for example, during the Russian Revolution, we are going to see people fleeing the communist regime. Entire towns are destroyed as a result of World War I, both literally on the battlefields, but also in terms of an entire generation of young men in some cases. Because a lot of boys, they go off to fight. They don't return home. And you can see right here this aerial picture of the Belgian countryside. Scarred to all heck. The trenches, the shell explosions. But the soldiers are not only bringing with them mental illness, they are also bringing with them physical illness. They are going to be the main reason why we're going to see a spread of influenza by the end of the war. We are going to see a huge amount of influenza cases that are going to emerge. And it's mostly because all of these boys are gathered together from around the world. And they're in close contact. They're going to give each other the illness, the Spanish flu, as it's called. And when they return home, they're going to bring with them the Spanish flu. That is going to lead to a lot of civilian deaths. About 5% of the world's population die as a result of the so-called Spanish flu. I would look up why it's called the Spanish flu. Long story short, Spain wasn't involved in World War I, didn't have any wartime censorship. Britain and France and the United States and Germany, they did. But Spain didn't, so they're able to announce, we have this many people dying of influenza. Who caused this flu? It was clearly the Spanish. It wasn't. It was probably the Americans and pig farmers. I have on the screen right now the casualties as it relates to how many soldiers were deployed. The Russians are going to have one of the largest amounts of casualties, reflecting this intense, brutal campaign in the Eastern Front. But now we have all of these scars, we need to actually pursue peace. And this is going to be achieved, hopefully, at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. It's largely going to be led by the Allies, the victorious Allies, mostly from countries like the US, France, and Great Britain. Italy is also there, but they're not important right now. Hopefully, they never want to feel important in Europe by being fascists. Anyway. Who are the major delegates at the Paris Peace Conference? From the Americans, we got the most important president in terms of international history, Woodrow Wilson. Wilson, idealistic guy. We need to have a permanent peace. We need no country to be victorious over the other countries, to feel that they're better than other countries. However, France and Great Britain, they're going to say, that's not something we want to do right now. Think about all of the young British and French men who died fighting these terrible Huns, these barbarians. Germany is France and Great Britain's enemy, even before World War I. Remember, the British competing with the Germans economically, the French competing with the Germans for Alsace-Lorraine. So there's a lot of Allied resentment towards the Germans. And while Wilson, as we'll see in a second, is proposing a lot of idealistic proposals for peace, he's largely going to be ignored because Britain and France get their way. They're very resentful of the Germans. What is Wilson saying idealistically? Well, he's going to offer a series of proposals called the 14 points. They're a series of what Wilson wants this peace agreement to look like. Obviously, there are 14 points in the 14 points, but I've boiled them down really to 5 major categories. For one thing, Wilson wants free trade, no more submarine warfare, no more government restrictions, no more blockades. We need freedom of the seas. That's what Wilson calls it. We also need to demilitarize. We need to not have such big militaries. We need to disarm. We need to prevent this idea of militarism from being a way to solve our problems. We also need to break up these huge empires, not only within Europe, but in their colonies as well. We need self-determination, the idea that an ethnic group has the right to decide what their government should be. In Europe, we are going to see countries achieve self-determination, places like Austria, places like Slovenia, or not yet, places like Poland, Belarus, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Finland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia. We are going to see that. That is something that will make its way into the eventual treaties. But another thing that Wilson is saying is let's end colonialism. Let's reduce imperial competition by granting these countries freedom, by giving them their independence. Wilson's also going to say, hey, secret treaties bad, no more of that, because nobody knows about them. And then you enter in these stupid agreements where if one guy attacks you, then you have to respond. So Wilson is going to say no secret treaties, like with the Belgians, like with the Belgians and the British, like with the Serbs and the Russians. And on top of that, Wilson is going to say, let's have a League of Nations, an international body of cooperation to solve all of our problems diplomatically. If you have beef with one country, go to the League of Nations. They'll settle it out. But as you might imagine, not a lot of this idealism will make its way into the eventual treaties that will form as a result of the Paris Peace Conference. They are mostly not realized. The only ones that kind of do get realized, self-determination for the European countries and a League of Nations. But even then, We're still going to have a lot of long-term tensions in Europe. And one of these long-term tensions is going to be how Germany is treated in the peace process. And that's going to be seen most dramatically with the Treaty of Versailles. That's a vocab word right there. What is the Treaty of Versailles? It is an agreement between the Germans and the Allied powers about ending this terrible war. And the Treaty of Versailles is mostly going to reflect that British and French resentment of the Germans. And we're definitely going to see that in what the stipulations of this treaty are, the stipulations. The goal of the British and the French is to completely weaken the Germans to never, ever, 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 ever wage a war again. We need to weaken them politically by taking their land. Alsace-Lorraine returns to France. All the colonies are going to be managed either by the British or the French, or at the very least, the League of Nations. And also make sure Germany doesn't have a military. So we are going to see disarmament. So I guess one of Wilson's points made it in there, but it wasn't for the British and the French as well. Germany, you can't build a military. Never, ever, ever do that. You also have to pay all the Allies reparations. You have to pay for the damages you did during the war, $33 billion. Germany's also going to lose its colonies, hand them over to the British or the French, or at the very least, the League of Nations. We'll talk about that in Chapter 7. But kind of the most petty reason or point in the Treaty of Versailles is going to be the so-called guilt clause. It's going to legally say Germany caused this stupid war. Even though it's, in my opinion, fairer to blame the Serbians or the Austrians, either of those groups of people more responsible for World War I than the Germans, because the Germans kind of on the same moral playing field as the other European and Western powers. Really, that's not going to be the case with World War II. Germany is definitely in the wrong there. I hope none of you disagree with that, but we'll get there, don't worry. So the goal of the Treaty of Versailles is to weaken Germany diplomatically, politically, and economically, and as we're going to see in future presentations, that will work for a little bit. But then that's going to cause a lot of resentment in Germany against the former Allied powers. We are going to see an increase of German nationalism, especially in response to the Treaty of Versailles. The Nazi Party, especially, is going to utilize popular anger against the Treaty of Versailles to gain political legitimacy. In terms of the other central powers, in terms of the colonies, and in terms of Russia, we are mostly going to see the decline of these land-based empires. Austria-Hungary is going to dissolve into countries like Austria, Hungary, Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia. Poland is made up of parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In the Middle East, we finally have the answer to the Eastern question. What happens when the Ottoman Empire falls? Who takes over that territory? Well, it's not going to be the Germans. It's not going to be the Russians, because those communists are scary to deal with. It's going to be the French and the British. The French and the British are going to divide up that land in the Middle East in the so-called Sykes-Picot Agreement. This is going to be a secret treaty, something Wilson hates, where a lot of the Middle East is going to be divided into various mandates, basically protectorates, of the British and the French. The French are going to get places like Syria, Lebanon, and the British, they're going to get Iraq, Jordan, and a place called Palestine. So we see that power vacuum of the Ottoman Empire being filled by the British and the French. So the Ottoman Empire largely going to go away. It's going to finally go away by the 1920s. We'll talk about that more in Chapter 7. But that's what's going on in the Ottomans. What's going on in the Russians? Well, the Russians pulled out of the war. They didn't get to be at the Treaty of Versailles. They did not get their territory back. Instead, what they did get was a lot of independent republics on their western border. And Russia, or more accurately, the Soviet Union, is not going to appreciate that. And on top of this, even though colonies were promised independence during the First World War, as a reward for their cooperation, we aren't going to see these colonies be given their independence. That's a huge slap in the face for anyone who actually believed the Europeans. That is going to contribute to nationalism, to resist the European presence in their countries. We aren't going to see independence until post-World War II, but we're seeing it largely emerge more organized in the form of nationalist parties as a result of the First World War. Another part of the Treaty of Versailles and the Paris Peace Conference is the establishment of a body called the League of Nations. It is an organization where people from around the world, or I should say delegates from every country that's in the League of Nations, is going to meet together in Paris and offer solutions to military conflicts, to famine. Because as you might imagine, Western Europe's not doing too hot right now because all of this military fighting has completely destroyed the Western European farmland. However, even though the League of Nations is going to propose a diplomatic solution basically to everything, it largely doesn't have any special force to back up its decisions. So if you did something the League of Nations didn't approve on, there were really no consequences. If you invaded Czechoslovakia, no consequences. If you invaded Manchuria, no consequences. And on top of this, countries are going to refuse to join the League of Nations. The United States, for example, even though Wilson proposed its existence, is going to say, nah, LOL, we're not joining the League of Nations. And oftentimes, these countries could leave whenever they wanted. There's no real commitment to make them stay in the League of Nations. So if you did something they didn't like invade Czechoslovakia, as I mentioned earlier, then you could be banished from the League of Nations or just outright quit. No consequences. So this is something that is successful in the sense that it exists, but in the sense of it solving real world problems, not so much, because hopefully there is never, ever, ever going to be a war to the same degree as World War I. There was. It was called World War II. So you should be able to identify what the 14 points were, give those 5 general categories, and how did they influence the peace agreements, if they did at all. But even though the peace agreements that are achieved in Paris are going to be signed by the international community, the peace that follows is going to be a temporary one, an ephemeral one. Politically, how is World War I impacting Europe in the short term? Well, for one thing, it's damaging the reputation of European imperialism. It is a major sign of weakness in the post-World War if you haven't recovered quickly enough. So this is delegitimizing these European empires. It is weakening the imperial drive for expansion, and also that slap in the face to those colonies for their independence in exchange for cooperation is going to lead to an increase of anti-colonial movements, especially to oust the Europeans. In Europe, we are going to see periods of political instability immediately following World War I. In Germany, for example, we are going to see a potential communist revolution play out. we are going to see those who attempt being the right word, to model the standard of the house, of the Russian Revolution. There is going to be a potential revolution in Germany, and largely because of those unpopular government actions during the First World War, like rationing and being involved in a stupid conflict. It's going to be quickly put down, and it's going to be put down by a very special group of people. These people, they carry they carry flags sometimes. They have swastikas. Yep, it is the Nazis. Well, it's actually the precursor to the Nazis, a organization of returning veterans who are very nationalistic, very anti-communist. They're basically going to act as the private military for the German civilian government, and they're going to put down suspected communist revolutionaries. We are going to see a failed German revolution after its defeat in World War I. However, we are going to see a lot of economic and political instability. In Germany, for example, there isn't enough money to pay off their reparations with France. Actually, that's not completely true. There is enough money. It's just not worth anything. We are going to see massive inflation in Germany that's preventing them from paying back their loans. So what does France do? Or paying back their reparations. So what does France do? Like any normal, respectable country, it is going to invade Germany. It's going to occupy what is called the Ruhr Valley in Western Germany. So to jumpstart the German economy, to prevent future hostility, we are going to see a plan drafted in the United States for loans to stimulate the German economy. We call this the Dawes Plan. It's going to provide a lot of loans to Germany so it can rebuild its economy, so it can pay back those reparations. And it is going to provide a lot of stability in the short term. We are going to see a republic exist in Germany. It's called the Weimar Republic. We'll talk about it more in chapter 8. And yet, this could all come crashing down if there was an international crisis that made it so American banks couldn't keep loaning money. We see here these new states in Eastern Europe, mostly as a result of the breakup of places like Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Russians. And finally, what is World War I doing to culture at large? Well, no longer do we have this European optimism. We are going to see a generation of young men who are going to, and young women, to be honest, who are going to have a more cynical outlook on life. Life is meaningless. Everything sucks. Look at that. We just slaughtered each other wholesale. Are we human? Can we truly call ourselves human beings? What does it mean to stick with tradition? Should we try new things? These are the questions of the lost generation and an emerging style of art called modernism. And you can see that expressed in this painting right here. I really like this painting. It's by a German artist by the name of Otto Dix, D-I-X. And it shows 3 World War I veterans that in many ways are barely recognizable as human beings. You got one dude who has to play cards with his feet because he lost his arms. We got a dude with no torso. We got a dude with amputee stump legs. It's showing how war took these human beings and turned them basically into machines. So we are seeing an explosion in visual art embodying these cynical ideas of human nature, that all of it was worthless and pointless, and we saw the death of a young generation. And yet, on the flip side, we're also going to see the rise of conservatism, especially in reaction to that notion of unlimited progress in science. We are going to see the rise of social conservatism. We are going to see the rise of traditionalism. And all of this is an impact of the First World War. We're going to look more closely at this impact when we talk about the 1920s a little bit in terms of art. But needless to say, it is going to be an intense period of self-reflection. Or, on the other hand, live it up till it's over. Because after all, it could end on a Belgian battlefield with a rifle bullet buried in your heart. On that note, this is very much related to another favorite painting of mine after the First World War. This is a painting called The Blind, Gassed. It's the blind leading the blind. It represents how pointless militarism and aggression of ideas of nationalism, military honor, led the world into war. On that note, think about this question right here. What are some of the results of the Paris Peace Conference? I would watch that Indiana Jones clip if you really want to look at the day-to-day battles of World War I. Thank you for your attention. I apologize for eating. I got hungry in the middle of that. I ate a smallish lunch. So I do apologize for my lack of professionalism, but none of you are watching this video by this chance. Leave a comment down below if you're watching it at this point. Say what your favorite animal is. Confuse those normies. You know what? I shouldn't be a teacher, quite frankly. I just don't care, really. No, I do care. I do care. But I don't care really about professionalism and stuff like that. No, I do care, actually. I do want you to do well. And obviously, if you have questions, please ask me. Email me, send me a remind. You guys are great. Thanks for sticking with me so long. Well, in terms of this video. All right, leave a like, drop that comment down below, and rock and roll in the free world, baby. We're going to talk about the Russian Revolution next time, and then we'll talk about my boy Joseph Stalin. Well, he's not really my boy. He did kill a lot of people. Anyway, thanks for watching. Outro over. Way back in the 1980s.